In April 1908, firefighters in LaPorte, Indiana pulled 4 bodies from the ashes of a burned-down farmhouse. The woman they pulled out had no head. Her teeth had been removed. Her body weighed 73 pounds less than the woman who had owned the place. 3 days later, a former hired hand told the sheriff to start digging behind the barn. They found a body, then another. Within 2 weeks, investigators had counted 14 victims buried in the hog pen and the soft ground around the chicken coop. Some were men who had come from Norway with their savings sewn into their coats. One was a 14-year-old foster daughter. 2 were the woman's own children. The woman who'd killed them might have been one of the bodies in the cellar, or she might have walked away with $100,000 in cash and lived another 40 years under a name nobody ever managed to prove. Tonight, 5 American women who killed for money, for boredom, for sexual gratification, for reasons they took to their graves. Some used poison. One used a .22 pistol on truckers along Interstate 75. One ran a boarding house in Sacramento where the tenants kept disappearing and the Social Security checks kept arriving in her mailbox. One called herself a nurse and slipped morphine into the water glasses of friends who'd known her for 30 years. Their names don't show up in the documentaries the way Bundy's and Dahmer's do. By the end of this video, you'll understand why that's a mistake. Her name at birth was Brynhild Paulsdatter Storset, born in November 1859 in a village called Selbu on the west coast of Norway. Her father was a stonemason. Local stories, the kind nobody could ever fully prove, said Brynhild had once been kicked in the stomach by a wealthy farmer at a country dance after she refused his advances. The baby she was carrying didn't survive. The farmer, by some accounts, died shortly afterward of stomach cancer that came on suddenly. She emigrated to Chicago at 22 and went to work as a domestic. She changed her name to Belle. In 1884, she married a Norwegian-American department store detective named Mads Sorensen, and the 2 of them opened a confectionery shop on the north side. The shop burned down within a year. The insurance paid out. They opened another shop. That one burned down too. The insurance paid out again. Belle and Mads adopted or fostered 4 children over the next decade. 2 of them, both infants, died of what doctors recorded as acute colitis. Both were insured. The doctors who signed the death certificates noted that the symptoms were also consistent with arsenic poisoning, but no autopsies were ordered. In July 1900, Mads Sorensen died at home. The family doctor had been treating him for an enlarged heart and signed the certificate as cardiac failure. A second doctor, called in by Mads's brother, suspected strychnine. Belle had served Mads a powdered medicine that morning. The brother demanded an exhumation. Belle, weeping, talked the local authorities out of it. She collected $8,500 on the 2 life insurance policies that, by remarkable coincidence, were both in force on the only single day they overlapped. She used the money to buy a 48-acre farm just outside LaPorte, Indiana, and married a Norwegian widower named Peter Gunness in April 1902. Peter brought a baby daughter to the marriage. The baby died within a week of the wedding while alone in the house with Belle. 8 months later, Peter himself was dead. Killed, Belle said, when a heavy iron sausage grinder fell off a high shelf and struck him on the back of the head while he was bending to put on his shoes. Belle's foster daughter, Jenny, age 14, told a classmate at school that her mother had killed Peter with a meat cleaver. The classmate told her parents. The parents told the sheriff. The coroner ruled it an accident anyway. Belle collected $3,000. Then she started placing personal ads in Norwegian language newspapers across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas. Comely widow, large farm in finest district of LaPorte County, Indiana. Desires acquaintance of gentlemen equally well provided. Object matrimony. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. Triflers need not apply. The men came. John Moe came from Elbow Lake, Minnesota with $1,000 in his pocket. Old Budsberg came from Iola, Wisconsin. Andrew Helgelian came from Aberdeen, South Dakota with $2,900. They all withdrew their savings before they left. None of them were ever seen leaving LaPorte. The foster daughter, Jenny, was sent away to a Lutheran college in Chicago in 1906, according to Belle. Nobody at the college had any record of her enrolling. In January 1908, Andrew Helgelian's brother Assel started writing letters to Belle from South Dakota, asking what had become of his brother. He wasn't satisfied with her answers. He told her he was coming to LaPorte to look for himself. He arrived to find the farmhouse in ashes. The hired hand, a man named Ray Lamphere, whom Belle had recently fired and accused of arson, was the obvious suspect. He went to prison. From his cell, he told a Methodist minister that Belle had paid him to help her fake her death. He said the headless woman in the cellar was a stranger Belle had drugged in Chicago and brought back to the farm for that exact purpose. He said Belle had walked away with the money. For the next 40 years, people who'd known Belle reported seeing her in California, in Mississippi, on a streetcar in Los Angeles, in a Mexican border town. The body count from her property eventually settled somewhere between 14 and 40. The next woman in this story was born Aileen Carol Pittman in Rochester, Michigan, on the 29th of February 1956. Her father, Leo Pittman, she never met. He was a convicted child molester who hanged himself in a Kansas prison cell when Aileen was 4. Her mother, Diane, abandoned her and her older brother to their grandparents in Troy, Michigan, and never came back. The grandparents drank heavily. Aileen later told interviewers that her grandfather, Laurie, began sexually abusing her when she was around 6. By 11, she was trading sex acts at school for cigarettes and pocket change. At 14, she was raped by a friend of her grandfather's and got pregnant. The grandparents sent her to a maternity home in Detroit, where she gave birth to a son in March 1971 and surrendered him for adoption. She never saw him. Her grandmother died of liver failure that summer. Her grandfather threw her out of the house. She was 15 and living in the woods behind a 7-Eleven, supporting herself with prostitution along the highway. She drifted south. By her late 20s, she had a record in 3 states for armed robbery, forgery, grand theft auto, and assault. In 1986, in a Daytona Beach gay bar called the Zodiac, she met a hotel maid named Tyria Moore. The two of them moved in together and lived in a series of motels, storage units, and rented rooms for the next 4 years. Aileen worked the truck stops along Interstate 75. Tyria washed sheets at a Casa del Mar. In December 1989, two deer hunters in Volusia County found a body wrapped in a carpet runner in a stretch of scrub pine off a county road. He was identified as Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics shop owner from Clearwater. 2.22 caliber bullets in his chest. His abandoned Cadillac had been found a week earlier near Daytona Beach, with the seat covers stripped and the keys missing. Over the next 11 months, 6 more men turned up dead along Florida highways. David Spears, a Sarasota construction worker. Charles Carskadden, an Illinois rodeo worker passing through. Peter Seams, a missionary from New Jersey whose body was never recovered. Troy Burress, a sausage salesman from Ocala. Charles Humphreys, a retired Air Force major. Walter Antonio, a trucker and reserve deputy from Brevard County. All middle-aged. All shot with the same .22 caliber pistol. All robbed of cash and stripped of identification. Police caught Aileen in January 1991 at a biker bar in Port Orange called The Last Resort. They arrested her on an outstanding weapons warrant and held her while Florida and federal agents tracked Tyria down to her sister's house in Pennsylvania. Tyria agreed to wear a wire and call Aileen at the jail. Over 3 days of recorded phone conversations, she manipulated Aileen into confessing out of love, Aileen said later, to keep Tyria out of trouble. At trial, Aileen testified that Richard Mallory had brutally raped her and that every subsequent killing had been self-defense against Johns, who'd tried to do the same. The jury didn't believe her. After her conviction, journalists discovered that Mallory had in fact served 10 years in a Maryland prison for violent rape, information the Florida prosecutors had never disclosed. It didn't save her. By then she'd been sentenced to death 6 times. On death row, she gave up the self-defense story. In a 2001 interview with the documentarian Nick Broomfield, recorded the day before her execution, she said she'd robbed and shot every one of those men in cold blood, that she would do it again if she got the chance, and that she wanted the state to kill her as soon as possible. Florida obliged. They executed her by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Starkey on the 9th of October 2002. She was 46 years old. Her final statement involved a mothership and Independence Day and Jesus in roughly that order. A 2-story Victorian boarding house stood at 1426 F Street in Midtown Sacramento. White siding, dark green trim, a gabled roof, flower beds along the front walk. The woman who ran it was a small, round, gray-haired grandmother in oversized eyeglasses named Dorothea Puente. The neighbors called her Dorothea, and they called her the kindest landlady in the world. She took in the tenants nobody else would house: schizophrenics, alcoholics, Vietnam veterans on disability, elderly people whose families had stopped returning calls. She charged them $350 a month and helped them sign up for the federal benefits they were entitled to. Then when they died, she stopped sending the checks back. Dorothea had a long record by the time she opened the boarding house in 1986. Born Dorothea Helen Gray in Redlands, California in 1929, she'd been orphaned by 10 and bounced through relatives, run away repeatedly, and married 4 times. She'd been arrested in the 1940s for forging checks at a Riverside bank. She'd run an illegal brothel out of a Sacramento bookkeeping office in the 1960s. In 1978, she'd been convicted of drugging and robbing elderly men she met in downtown bars, slipping them sedatives, walking them home, stealing their wallets and jewelry. She got probation. 3 years later, she was arrested again, this time for a near-identical scheme that had killed at least one of her victims, a 74-year-old man named Ruth Monroe, whose death was originally ruled suicide. The Monroe case got reduced to grand theft. Dorothea served 3 years in the California State Women's Prison at Frontera and was released in September 1985 on parole. Her parole conditions explicitly forbade her from handling other people's government benefits. Within months, she had opened the F Street boarding house and was doing exactly that. In November 1988, a Sacramento social worker named Judy Moyse came looking for one of her caseload, a 52-year-old developmentally disabled man named Alvaro Bert Montoya. He'd been living at Dorothea's. He hadn't checked in. Dorothea told her Alvaro had taken a Greyhound bus to Mexico to visit his family. The story didn't track. Alvaro didn't travel without telling Judy first. Judy called Sacramento police. Detective John Cabrera came to the house with a search warrant on the 11th of November. He noticed the soil in the backyard had been disturbed in several places. He started digging. He found Alvaro Montoya wrapped in a bed sheet in a shallow grave under the rose bushes. Then they found Betty Palmer, age 78, missing since 1986. Then Dorothy Miller. Then James Gallup. Then Vera Faye Martin. Then Benjamin Fink. Then Leona Carpenter. 7 bodies in total. Some had been in the ground for 2.5 years. Dorothea had been collecting their Social Security and disability checks the entire time, forging their signatures, depositing the money in her own accounts. She fled to Los Angeles before she could be charged, took a bus down, checked into a downtown hotel, and went to a bar in the Skid Row area. She struck up a conversation with an elderly retired carpenter named Charles Wilgis and was working him toward an invitation to move into his apartment when he excused himself to use the payphone. He'd recognized her face from a CNN broadcast that afternoon. He called the FBI. A Sacramento jury convicted her of 3 of the 7 murders in 1993. The other 4 counts ended in deadlock. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms and died in prison in March 2011 at the age of 82. In October 1954, a 48-year-old factory worker named Samuel Doss was admitted to a Tulsa hospital with severe abdominal pain. Doctors diagnosed a flu-like infection, treated him with intravenous fluids, observed him for 3 weeks, watched him improve, and discharged him on the morning of October 5th. He went home, ate a bowl of stewed prunes his wife had prepared for him, and was dead before midnight. The doctor who'd treated him in the hospital didn't believe it. Samuel had walked out of his ward. He ordered an autopsy. The pathologist found enough arsenic in Samuel's stomach lining to kill a draft horse. Police questioned his wife, a 49-year-old grandmother named Nannie Doss. She was small, round, bespectacled, and she giggled through the first round of questioning. She giggled through the second. By the 3rd day, she was asking the detectives if she could read a romance magazine while she answered their questions. Then she started talking. By the time the detectives finished writing it all down, Nannie had confessed to killing 4 husbands, her own mother, 2 of her sisters, 2 of her own children, a grandson, and a nephew. 11 people, most of them poisoned with arsenic-laced rat poison stirred into stewed prunes, coffee, or pork roast. Nannie had been born Nancy Hazel in November 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama. Her father was a tenant farmer named James Hazel, who beat all 5 of his children and pulled Nannie out of school at the end of 4th grade to work the cotton fields. She always blamed a head injury from a childhood train accident. She'd been knocked against a metal seat back during a sudden stop at age 7 for the migraines and depressions that troubled her the rest of her life. She married her first husband, Charlie Braggs, in 1921 at age 16. 2 of their 4 daughters died as infants from what was officially recorded as food poisoning. Charlie, frightened, took the 2 surviving girls and left her in 1928. He was the only husband who got out alive. She married Frank Harrelson in 1929. He drank. She poisoned his whiskey in 1945 and collected on a small life insurance policy. She married Arlie Lanning in 1947. He died in 1952 of what the doctor wrote down as heart failure. She married Richard Morton in 1953. He lived 3 months. She married Samuel Doss in June 1954, and he was dead by October. Every husband after the first she met through romance magazines. The same kind of lonely hearts mail-order columns Belle Gunness had used in the 1900s. She read them in bed, dog-eared the pages, wrote the men long letters about her dreams of true love. Then she met them, married them, and killed them. When the Tulsa detective Harry Steege asked her why she'd done it, she said the husbands had been disappointing. Frank had been a drunk, Arlie had been dull, Richard had cheated, Samuel hadn't let her watch her favorite radio shows and had insisted on keeping all their money in his own name. So she killed him. The Oklahoma press called her the giggling granny and the lonely hearts killer and the black widow of Tulsa. She avoided the electric chair only because the prosecutor refused to ask the jury for the death penalty against a woman. She was sentenced to life in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAllister and worked in the prison laundry until leukemia killed her in June 1965. She was 60 years old. The 5th woman is the one historians still argue about, because by her own count, her victims numbered above 30, and the actual figure is almost certainly higher. Her name was Jane Toppan, and she was a private nurse working in eastern Massachusetts at the turn of the 20th century. In the summer of 1901, Jane was hired by an old friend, a Cape Cod woman named Mattie Davis, who ran a summer guest house in Catamate. Mattie had collapsed in a Boston street while visiting Jane to collect an unpaid debt. Jane nursed her at home for a week, sat at her bedside, watched her die. Then Mattie's husband Alden died. Then their married daughter Genevieve. Then their other daughter Mary, the wife of a man named Irving Gibbs. 4 members of one family in 6 weeks. Irving Gibbs was the only one in the household who hadn't taken sick. He demanded an autopsy on his wife. The state toxicologist Edward Wood found morphine and atropine in her tissue samples, dosed in alternating cycles calibrated to mimic natural decline. When detectives arrested Jane in October 1901, she confessed to 31 murders going back nearly 20 years. Patients she'd nursed in private homes, friends she'd visited, 2 members of her own foster family, the Dunhams, her foster sister Edna, her landlords. She told the alienist who interviewed her that she got into bed with her victims as they were dying and that the experience gave her sexual pleasure. She told Dr. Henry Stedman, the lead psychiatrist on her case, that her ambition was to kill more helpless people than any other person in the history of the world. She'd been born Honora Kelly in Boston in 1854 to Irish immigrant parents. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Honora was an infant. Her father, a tailor named Peter Kelly, known to neighbors as Kelly the Crack on account of his deteriorating mental illness, dropped Honora and her older sister Delia at the Boston Female Asylum, and was later committed to an asylum himself after his employer found him attempting to sew his own eyelids shut. Delia became a prostitute and died of alcoholism. Honora was indentured at age 6 to a family in Lowell named Toppan, who renamed her Jane and raised her as an unpaid servant. She trained as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital in the early 1880s, where she developed the habit of stealing morphine and atropine from the dispensary and experimenting on patients with combinations of the two. She would dose them, watch them slip toward death, then revive them with stimulants, then dose them again. She kept detailed notes. The hospital noticed she was a thief and quietly let her go. They did not report her to the state. She moved into private nursing in 1891 and worked steadily across Boston, Cambridge, and Cape Cod for the next decade. A Barnstable County jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity in June 1902. She was committed to Taunton State Hospital and lived there for the next 36 years. Staff reported that she occasionally beckoned new orderlies into her room and asked them with great warmth to bring her some morphine and sit with her on the bed. She died at Taunton in August 1938 at the age of 84. The official confirmed count is 31. The actual count is unknown. 5 women. About 70 confirmed kills between them, and probably twice that if you counted the cases that never came to court. Belle Gunness used a hammer and a hog pen. Aileen Wuornos used a .22 along the Interstate. Dorothea Puente buried hers under the rose bushes and cashed their checks. Nannie Doss used rat poison and stewed prunes. Jane Toppan used a syringe and got into bed with them while they died. 4 of the 5 married into their crimes or used some version of domestic warmth as the lure. The 5th, Aileen, was the only one who killed strangers. She's the one most people have heard of. The other 4 are mostly forgotten outside the small group of true crime obsessives who collect their stories on message boards. If you found this useful, hit subscribe. There are more stories like these on the channel, and I post a new one every Sunday. Drop a comment with the woman you'd like covered next, and I'll read everyone. Thanks for watching.